Jean-Pierre Filiu is a renowned public intellectual and scholar of the Middle East. He's a professor of Middle East Studies at Sciences Po, the Paris School of International Affairs, where he's been teaching since 2006. He's held visiting professorships at the Columbia School of International and Public Affairs and the Georgetown School of Foreign Service. Professor Filiu was a career diplomat from 1988 to 2006, following humanitarian missions in Afghanistan and Lebanon. He was assigned to Amman before becoming Deputy Chief of Mission in Damascus and in Tunis. He served also as an advisor to the French Prime Minister, the Minister of Defense, and the Minister of the Interior. In 2012, President François Hollande appointed Professor Filiu to the draft committee that releases the White Book for Defense and National Security. Professor Filiu is the author of many books and articles, among them Apocalypse in Islam, The Arab Revolution, 10 Lessons from the Democratic Uprising, and Gaza, the History. His works on contemporary Islam and the Arab world have been published in a dozen languages. Professor Filiu also wrote the text of Best of Enemies, a graphic novel about the U.S. and the Middle East. Curious to see that. I haven't seen that yet. Today he'll speak to us about his latest book, From Deep State to Islamic State, the Arab Counter-Revolution and its Jihadi Legacy. Flyers with discount codes are available just outside the conference room if you'd like to purchase that book. Before handing over the podium, I just want to add that there are a lot of people out there these days offering analyses about the Islamic State. Many are interesting and many are provocative, but ultimately they're only as useful as the local knowledge on which they're based, which, as we know, is becoming increasingly hard to come by. The last time I saw Professor Filiu was at, I believe, a conference in Sweden, where he had just stepped off a plane from Syria, and I believe that there was some danger involved in that particular trip, and he's been back to the region many times before. And I think that's the real difference, and that's sort of what we value here at the CNES, is we really do like to bring people who not only can theorize, but also have that local knowledge and that local experience. And Jean-Pierre Filiu is really one of, when it comes to Syria and the Islamic State, he's really one of the few people, I think, who have that local knowledge. So we're delighted to have him with us today. Anyway, it gives me special pleasure to offer a very warm welcome to Professor Jean-Pierre Filiu.
Thank you. So, again, not again. First, I'm really happy to be back at Berkeley. I should have been on time. It's not because I'm French, you know. French can be punctual, but sometimes, you know, life is life. And especially at Stephens Hall, because when I was here as a cultural attaché for France from 93 to 96, that was part of the French Berkeley Fund and the International Area Studies. And I was a frequent visitor, so I'm happy to be back. So I don't know how much time we have.
Not too much. Maybe you can speak for about 20 minutes.
20 minutes, so we can have a Q&A. So the idea writing this book, which was published at the beginning of the summer, was to give, as a historian, but also as Professor Gottreich was kind enough to say, somebody who had field experience, sometimes not very rosy experience with the jihadis. You know, I started when I was humanitarian in the resistance controlled part of Afghanistan, when I met my first jihadis, along with Olivier Roy at the same moment, you know, and we were very struck by the fact that those people, how could I put it, being respectful and at the same time critical, they were not sharing the same time space as us, you know. They were really in a second life, in another reality, because they were already turning global. And the whole idea, as I wrote through articles, is to try and explain how global jihad is a radical breakaway from 14th century tradition of jihad, because in Islam you always had jihad and you always will have jihad. But jihad is since the 18th century defensive. The last campaign of offensive jihad were waged by the Mughal Empire in India and by the Ottoman Empire in Central Europe. So since that time it has been defensive jihad, but anyway, defensive or offensive in Islam, jihad is always connected to a territory and a population. A territory to protect and population to defend, or a territory to submit and a population to conquer. Oh, it's the contrary. And global jihad is cutting this relationship with population as a territory, which is by considering the whole world being land of jihad. But I had written about that after others, but what I wanted to bring in this essay, in fact, it was the sad sequel to my Arab Revolution and 10 lessons about the democratic uprising, which I wrote too quickly, but I wrote it too quickly while being at Columbia, not because I was not busy at Columbia. You are as busy at Columbia as you are at Berkeley, believe it or not, but because I knew first that it was a revolution, second that it would last for many years, third that after a little amount of time it would get so confused and so confusing that everybody would say, what is happening? So I wanted just to put 10 lessons, which were not lessons, it's make it too professorial, but it was more 10 milestones. Of course, that was the shiny part of this revolution when everything was promising, even though I knew, I tried not to use the expression Arab Spring because I was sure that as in any revolutionary process, soon it would become very dirty and ugly and bloody, which is the case right now. So this, I wouldn't give it as a title, the Arab counter-revolution, so I use it in the subtitle. And at the same time, I wanted to explain how those various regimes in the Arab world, which are basically bankrupt, bankrupt because they are not even able to deliver the only commodity that they pretend to deliver, which is security. Today you have reached level of political violence in Egypt that are unprecedented since Bonaparte's invasion in 1798. And Bashar al-Assad has managed to bring back Syria to levels of terror unprecedented since Tamerlan in 1400. So even when it comes to security, they are bankrupt. They are bankrupt because the rent they're living on is running more and more drier and drier. Whether the oil rent, because of the fall of the oil price, or the strategic rent, which is the one they are extracting from their foreign patrons, mainly just America for Egypt since Camp David, and Russia for Syria. And you see that just to keep them afloat, they are absorbing an amount of resources that is again unprecedented. You know, Mubarak ran Egypt on the basis of $2, $3, $4, $5 billion a year between the Gulfies and the US money. Sisi needs $20 billion a year just to keep, you know, it going with 3 times more political prisoners than during the worst of Mubarak, with, you know, a level of political violence that I already mentioned. And when you're talking about Syria and Assad, you know, only to keep control on, you know, a modicum of power, he had to force half of his population, half of out of their homes, and to wage a war that is again unprecedented against his own people. You know, I don't even mention the chemical gas bombings of August 2013, but I was not there when the missile failed, but I witnessed in Aleppo strikes of ballistic missiles. No dictator has ever used ballistic missiles on his own population. You know? Saddam had already used gas on his own population. Ballistic missiles of 300 kilometers length, there's no precedent to that. Yemen, you saw how, you know, the only successful transition, because it was supposed to be a nice transition when the dictator would kindly accept to transfer power to his successor, it became a nightmare, you know, with Ali Abdullah Saleh, the former president, playing on the Jihadis and playing on the Houthis, and then you had this coalition that went in. But what I wanted to, because my trade is being a historian, so I wanted to give an historical perspective to this nightmare, because it's a man-made nightmare. It has nothing to do with Arabness or with Islam, you know. It's totally the result of those regimes being ready to wage the ultimate violence on their own people just to keep control of the absolute power. So I tried to coin. I'm not very good at concepts, and even worse than Olivier at methodology, which should be, you know, the ultimate sentence against me. But I managed to coin a concept which is the modern Mamluks. So why the Mamluks? So it has been done, you know, specifically for Egypt, but with a precedent that is not the one I'm using, because I'm using the Mamluk of the classical times, you know, 13 to beginning of the 16th century, when they were controlling Egypt and Syria. So why the Mamluks? Because Mamluks are totally and are structurally alienated from their own society. You know, in the Middle Ages, they didn't speak the language, they didn't share the customs, they very seldom marry. Well, ultimately you end up always marrying the locals, but you know, they were forbidden to do that. I found, you know, many traits that you can find today in the military cliques that are ruling the Arab world. But what was more important to me was the fact that during the Mamluk time, they had a caliph. But the caliph was in a golden cage. You know, he was supposedly one of the survivors of the great massacre of the Abbasid family in 1258. And the prayer and on Friday was given in his name, but in fact he was confined to this golden gaol. And my parallel is that today Caliph is the people. You know, you invoke the people, you make elections. Otherwise, you don't understand why modern Mamluks keep, you know, organizing electoral farce where they always get 90, 95, 97, 98%, you know. It doesn't make sense. Only if you enter the logic that all this is done in the name of the people, the same way everything was done during Mamluk times in the name of the Caliph, but the Caliph was as powerless as the people are today in those regimes. So I try to explain why, you know, using the deep state, which is initially a Turkish concept, but a Turkish concept that has disseminated all over the Arab world with the revolution, because nobody was speaking about the deep state before, because the state was there, it was very clear. You know, you had the one-party system, the security services, the political police, but the state, the same way in Turkey 20 years ago, had to develop deep networks, which is basically criminal networks, in order to finance and wage a dirty war against Kurdish guerrillas or leftist opposition. The same way, the modern Mamluks had to develop deep networks, and I try to explain that with various examples, mainly using Egypt, Syria, and Yemen, because they are the most violent examples today, but also referring to what I call the Algerian matrix. Because in fact, most of what is happening now in the Middle East happened already in North Africa 20 years ago, with the Algerian Black Decade, that in fact was provoked by a military coup that has a lot to compare, a lot of similarity with the way Mubarak was deposed. You know, when Mubarak was deposed, everybody say, "Oh, it's revolution," and by the way, it could have been a revolution, but the reality was a coup. Technically, it was a coup. You had a military junta, nobody knew exactly, and until today, nobody know exactly, not even the name, but the number of the generals, you know, forming this junta. The same way in Algeria, you had the so-called decision makers, les décideurs. So in both instances, what was presented in Algeria in '92 with the coup against Ben Jedid as a preemptive strike against a possible Islamist-led government, what was presented in Egypt as the military fulfilling the aspiration of the people to oust the dictator, was in fact the same old Mamluk logic, you know, trying just to implement damage control in order to keep their grip on power, and of course their potential to racketeer the national resources of the country, which is the case in both. You know, if there is something common between Algeria and Egypt, is that the military budget is top secret. Nobody knows how much, you know, they spend, because it's totally out of reach of the population and the general institution. It is something that has been preserved. And what happened in Algeria in the decade of the 90s is what I called, with very sad irony, some kind of implementation of Bertolt Brecht saying, you know, in '53, when you had the riots against the communist East Germany, and well, Brecht was critical, but he was still part of the system, and he said, as commenting it, well, you know, if the people are against us and we are the People's Republic, then let's dissolve the people, you know. And in fact, in Algeria in the 90s, in Syria today, they dissolved the people. That means that they manage through massacres, mass displacement, liquidation of a whole strata of activists, to reshape the people in order to have a people that would accept their rule in a way that will not anymore be contested. And you see that very deep in Algeria today. In Algeria, people were plunged into so much tragedy and distress that they were led to rejoice when a president on a wheelchair was re-elected after having been silent during the whole campaign. So he's really a mummy president. He's a caricature of what the decision makers of modern Mamluk would have as a convenient president. And you see that in Syria today, with, as I told you, half of the population expelled forcibly. So basically, Bashar is exporting his opposition outside. And because the opposition is massively popular, despite everything that has been said here and there, then you have millions and millions of refugees. And it will go on as long as a new reality doesn't emerge in Syria. But I will just conclude with ISIS. Everywhere. It was the case in Algeria in the 90s. No matter how, you had certain sectors of the Islamic Salvation Front that were certainly far from democratic, the same way with the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, the same way with significant sectors of the Syrian opposition. But instead of doing it the Tunisian way, which was a way engaging it and forcing them to accept the rule of the game and of plurality, violence served as a general way of treating this alternative, and in fact played in the hand of the jihadis everywhere. In Algeria in the 90s, you know, chronology matters for historians, not so much methodology, but chronology. And it's very clear. You don't have jihadi guerrilla in Algeria until the military coup. They start after the coup. But it's always, they will always present the chronology in a different way. The same way when Assad says in March 2011, during the first peaceful march, it's a terrorist plot. It's Al-Qaeda, because at that time nobody was speaking about ISIS, and you had nobody, not one weapon in the street, not even one stone in the street. But of course, the self-fulfilling prophecy ultimately takes a reality. Same way in Egypt. No matter how many the mistakes of the Muslim Brotherhood, no matter even the fact that they had constituted militias that could be described as proto-fascist to quell their own opposition, it was nothing like what happened since the coup, where, to give you just an indication, you have in the Sinai a jihadi group, which is 1,000, maybe 2,000 members strong, not more, compared to 500,000 Egyptian army. So in Syria, it's clear Bashar al-Assad worked with the jihadis. It's a long story, I could go into it. He released hundreds of them. He had his security apparatus had long-standing cooperation with Baghdadi and the ISIS. In Egypt, it's not that clear, but certainly it ends up the same way. That means that, which is why I call the jihadi legacy, is the direct product of those regimes refusing to accept the very simple right of their own people to self-determination. I will close on that note, because now they are trying, all of them, to gain a little bit more time by pretending they are the only defense between the jihadis and the rest of the world, in order, you know, to mobilize the rent, the strategic rent, the military rent. Not only it's wrong, but it's exactly the contrary. And unfortunately, this discourse is getting more and more popular. I'm not up to date in America, but I can tell you in Europe it's getting more and more popular when people say, okay, let's work with Bashar al-Assad. It was a big mistake, a big error not to work with him during all those years. In that case, you know, historians are only good at predicting the past, but I can tell you that if we, and let's put everything you want behind the we, I would prefer United Nations, but it's sometimes a complex issue. If we prefer the dictators to the jihadis, we'll get more dictators and more jihadis. You know, they will grow together. Thank you so much for your kind attention.
Do you think that we still can put ISIS under this jihadi concept, or we, as a researcher, should think about something different? ISIS is a jihadi, and based on our, you know, criteria, when we put whether or not this is jihadi or not jihadi Muslim.
For me, it's pretty simple. Jihadi is global. If you're national, you can be violent, but you're still national. And the group you're studying, you know, there was a moment of truth, which was 97, when you had the attack on Luxor and the tourists. And before that, the group had attacked the security forces mainly, and other symbolic targets, but they were domestic targets. And the fact that the group launched Luxor attacks was part of a debate inside Al-Qaeda and Islamic Jihad as to make it global and not anymore national. So in that case, they become jihadis, but you know better than me, because that's your field of research, that because of the Luxor attack, this group stopped, made a call to an halt for violence, because they felt this was not what they wanted to do. So for me, but then you can have subcategories. You have the jihadis who are global, who are not connected ultimately to a land and the people, who can decide tomorrow we attack here, we attack there, who can say we move from Raqqa to Derna. You know, this was Gamaa who would stay in the Nile Valley. They would never have gone. So I think that and talking about ISIS, I think it's a successful Al-Qaeda. But I don't see, they learn from their mistakes, from their failures. There was a Zarqawi transition period where, I didn't want to bring that, but of course all this would have been impossible without the US invasion of Iraq in 2003. Because it was like, you know, the beginning of the Syrian revolution, there was not a jihadi group in Iraq at that time. So it was the occupation and the fact that the army was disbanded and the Ba'ath Party banned, which brought immediately to the guerrilla the people who are now at the nucleus of ISIS and who are former officers of Saddam Hussein. Which brings me to a remark, a comment, that yes, ISIS is a successful Al-Qaeda, but probably, and contrary to Al-Qaeda, the top decision makers in ISIS are far more opportunist than ideological. I think my feel is that Baghdadi is the front. I don't think the guy is running the outfit. It's far more, it's the way they act, it's people with intelligence background, security background, guerrilla background, the way they connect their own operation over there in the Middle East, where they can, manage coordinated operation on 4 or 5 different fronts. Very few armies in today's world can do that. So those people have this background, and of course the way they can inspire and, in my view, instruct a worldwide terrorist campaign. In 1 month, Ankara, Sinai, Beirut, Paris, Tunis, and it's not over. So I don't see, I see a continuity when it comes to jihadi principles, but I see certainly an improvement in the fighting techniques and terrorist operations that is very frightening. Those people are far more dangerous than Al-Qaeda. I don't know how to put it on a scale. 1 to 10, 1 to 20, 1 to 50 maybe. And so far they have the initiative, and they keep it.